All right, good morning, guys. So today we're going to do some examples on 8.1, 8.2, which are called polynomials. This will be the last lesson that you'll have on your test this week. And I think you'll see these as multiple choice on your test. Okay, here it goes. You need to know, let me just accept some people. Hold on. Okay, all right, so now that a lot of you are here. All right, we're about to start today's lesson. What you need to know about sections 8.1 and 8.2 is called polynomials, and there's a few vocabulary words that you need to know for your test. There'll be multiple choice questions, but here they go. Polynomials is just a group of terms that are being added or subtracted together. So for example, here's a polynomial. 4x cubed plus 3x squared plus 5x minus 2. That's called a polynomial because you have some terms that are being added or subtracted. So now here's the vocabulary term that you need to know for your test. You need to know what the polynomial is called based on the number of terms that it has. So for example, a polynomial that only has one term, like let's say, here's a polynomial like 5x. That polynomial is called a monomial because it only has one term that is being added or subtracted. It's just a 5x. So make sure you know monomial means one term. Next, a polynomial that has two terms is called a binomial. So for example, let's say we have like x squared plus 5x. That polynomial right there is called a binomial because it has two terms that are being added or subtracted. Nishay, question. So, all right, so monomial one term, binomial two terms, so trinomial three terms. So for example, if you have x squared plus 5x minus 3, that's called a trinomial because you have three terms that are being added or subtracted. Finally, the last vocabulary term that you need to know for your test is polynomial. So anything that's just 4 or more is just called a polynomial. So for example, the one that's up there, I guess I'll just write it here. The 4x cubed plus the 3x squared plus the 5x minus 2. This is called a polynomial because it has 4 terms. And then anything that has 4 or more would be called a polynomial. So again, for your test, let me erase this one. For your test this Friday, make sure you know the vocabulary. Monomial means one, binomial means 2 terms, trinomial means 3 terms, and polynomial means 4 or more terms. The other vocabulary that you need to know, I guess the last one, is also polynomials have a name by degree. Okay, and degree means the exponent. So, for example, if the exponent is 0, your polynomial will be called a constant. So let me give you an example. So p of x, let's say I give you 5x to the 0. That's an example of a constant because x to the 0, obviously, the exponent is 0, but x to the 0 just goes away, and that's just the number 5. So that's just 5. So in other words, 5, 6, 3, like all the regular numbers, those are called constants. So, for example, like this minus 3, that's the constant. Or this minus 2, that's the constant. So if it's just a regular number, that's called a constant. Next, if something, the degree, if the exponent is 1, then it's called linear. So here's an example of a linear. Let's say you have x minus 2. This polynomial is a linear, and specifically, like I guess when you start practicing the names, this would be called a linear binomial. So polynomials have 2 names. One is based on the exponent, and one is based on the number of terms. So x minus 2 is called a linear binomial. The first one that I gave you, the 5, that's just called a constant monomial. So again, constant because the degree was 0, monomial because there was only one term. This one is linear because the degree is 1, and binomial because there are 2. So let's try another one. Quadratic. So a quadratic would just be like x squared. Or you can do x squared plus 3. So that's called a quadratic binomial. So again, on the test, you're just going to have to tell me the name. You'll have an example, and then you just have to circle what is the name of it. This would be called a quadratic binomial. So let's try another one. Cubic. For the cubic, let's start with something easy like x to the third. That's clearly a cubic. Specifically, that's a cubic monomial, because I just did that. So cubic monomial. Next, let's do a quartic. Quartic means it's just going to be x to the fourth. And finally, quintic. So these are the ones you have to know, the names. Constant, linear, quadratic, cubic, quartic, quintic, and then no monomial, binomial, trinomial, polynomial. So those are the ones you have to know for the test. Now, not on the test, but like I guess on regular school, here's something else you also need to know about the cubics, quadratics, and quartics. So for example, this one, quintic. X to the fifth, that's a quintic, and that's what you'll see on this test. But let me give you another example of a quintic. So let's say you had like x cubed y squared times y squared. This is also an example of a quintic. Although it's x to the third and then a y squared, since they're being multiplied together, the overall degree is 5, because you would be adding like the 3 plus 2. So this is actually called a quintic. I didn't put any of those on the test, because the ones on the test are just really basic, like these, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you should know that this is also a quintic. Or like a quartic. Let me show you an example of a quartic. We could have like x squared times y squared plus 8, I guess. That's an example of a quartic binomial because x squared times y squared becomes the quartic, and then the plus 8 just makes it a binomial. So that's a quartic. And then like the one Nishay mentioned earlier, I forgot what he said, but I don't know, I think he had like 5x squared y. Okay, so 5x squared y, that's an example of a cubic monomial because the x squared times the y to the first becomes a cubic, and then it's just a one term, so monomial. So now I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to give you, actually no, let's try one example together and then I'll give you some time to practice these terms. And I only put one of these on your test Friday, and it's multiple choice, so you just have to know the names. So let's practice one and then I'll answer questions. Here's example number 1. Taking this polynomial here, identify the following. So number 1, I have x cubed y minus 2xy plus 5x. So first, let's determine if this is a monomial, binomial, trinomial, or a polynomial. So count how many terms are being added. So I have one term here, I have a second term there, and I have a third term that's being added or subtracted. So this is called a trinomial because there was three things or three terms that were being added or subtracted. Next, let's go ahead and write down the coefficient of each term. So the first term is just x cubed y, so that means that the coefficient was a 1. My next term is negative 2xy, so that means that my coefficient is a negative 2. The last term is a plus 5x, so the coefficient is a positive 5. So those are the coefficients. Now let's do the degree, so the exponent of each term. And this is what I was trying to tell you. The first term, x cubed y, its final degree is a 4 because you have an x to the third times the y to the first, and you have to add the 3 and the 1 together. So that degree is a 4. The next one is minus 2xy. The degree for that term would be a 2 because you have to add the x to the first times the y to the first. So that becomes 2. And then the last term is just linear because the degree, the exponent or the degree is just 1. So the last term is linear. And then the degree of the polynomial is going to be the highest, like the highest degree, or like the, yeah, highest exponent, I guess. So this, the overall degree of this polynomial should be the 4, the quartic, because that's the highest degree of any of the terms. So the degree of the polynomial is just going to be the highest degree of any of the terms, which in this case was a 4, so you would call it a quartic. So at the end of the day, you would call this a quartic trinomial. That's what you would circle, quartic trinomial. Okay, I'm going to give you some time to practice. So here's the answer for number 2. Oh, and one thing I did forget to mention about these polynomials, you want to put them in standard form. So like you always have, you're supposed to write them as like the highest degree first. So 4x cubed, 3x squared plus 5x minus 2. So at the end, make sure you have them in standard form. I guess if it asks you. So number 2, it would be called a polynomial because there was 4 terms that were being added or subtracted. The coefficient of the first term is just a 9 because it's just a constant. The coefficient of the second term is a -1 because of the negative. The coefficient of the third term is actually a 1/6 because of this numerator and denominator here. And then the coefficient of the last term is a -5. So those are the coefficients. The degree of each term. Constants always have a degree of 0 because like I showed you over here, you can write 9 as like 9x to the 0 power, so the degree is 0. Next, you need to, that's going to be a cubic, not a cubic, a quintic, because you have y to the third, but then you have times x times z, so you have to add 3 plus 1 plus 1, so that's a quintic. The next term looks like a quartic, 2 plus 1 plus 1, and then the last term looks like a cubic. The degree of the entire polynomial is the highest exponent or the highest degree, so a 5 here, quintic. So finally, on your test Friday, there's only one of these questions. It's multiple choice, and you just need to tell me that this is called a quintic polynomial. Quintic polynomial, that's the one you would circle. The rest, I'll let you do by yourself. They're just practice. Okay, I need to show you the second lesson for today. So that's 8.1. You do have some homework in the online book over this, so make sure you do the 8.1 homework. Second lesson. The second lesson is about graphing these polynomials. So 8.2. You need to know, you don't need to know how to specifically graph them. You just need to know something called the end behavior. So let me show you what that is. First of all, eventually, our next unit, we will graph polynomials. So these are what the graphs look like. For this first test, I guess for this test Friday, you just need to know, you don't need to know how to graph it, you just need to know what's called the end behavior. Okay, so let me show you what the end behaviors are. Your options for end behavior are up and up, down and down, down and up, and then finally up and down. So I'll explain to you what these mean. And again, there's one of these questions on your test that's going to ask you, like, what is the end behavior? And you're just going to tell me either up and up, down and down, down and up, or up and down. Okay, so this is what this nonsense means. Up and up. That means that if you were to graph your polynomial, if it starts, I guess you look at the graph from left to right. If the graph starts like a positive infinity and then it goes towards positive infinity, that's called the up and up. So in other words, if the graph just looks like this, like a parabola opening up, that's called up and behavior. Next, if your graph goes down, like with the negative, to negative infinity, that's called down, down. So again, if you look at the graph from left to right, it starts at negative infinity and it ends at negative infinity. That's called down, down. Next, if the graph, again, you have to always look at the graph from left to right. If the graph starts down at negative infinity, but it ends at a positive infinity, that is called down, up. And finally, if the graph starts at a positive infinity, but ends at a negative infinity, that's called the up-down behavior. So you need to know, you're just going to type it up like up, up, down, 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 up, or up, down. And that's based on the graph. But you don't have to graph them, so here's how else you can tell. You can tell the end behavior without graphing by looking at your leading term of your polynomial. So let's find it. Example 1 here. Your leading term was the 4x to the 4th. So here, your coefficient was positive, and it had an even power. So let me write down positive coefficient, even power. Those will always be up and up behavior, always. So if you have a leading term with a positive coefficient and an even power, it will always be an up and up behavior. Next one, let's find the leading term here. So the one with the highest exponent, it's the negative x squared. So here your coefficient is negative. So negative coefficient, but your power is still even. Even power. Those will always have a down, down behavior. So if your leading term has a negative coefficient with an even power, those will always be called down, down behavior. Okay, let's try the other two, but basically we're making this chart right here. Okay, so the other two are called down, up and up, down. So let's look at down, up. You look at your leading term, there's only one, which is the x cubed. That is a positive coefficient with an odd power. So if your leading term is positive coefficient with an odd power, it will always be the down, up behavior. And finally, if your leading term is a negative coefficient with an odd power, odd power, you will have a up, down behavior. So what we just went over is this little chart is summarized here. So take a look at it here. When your coefficient is positive and it's even, it's called up, up. When it's negative and it's even, it's called down, down. If the coefficient is positive but the power is odd, it's called down, up. And then if the coefficient is negative and the power is odd, it's called up, down. So practice number 1 and number 2 right here. Try it. You will be doing this on the test Friday. You're going to tell me what the behavior is. So number 1, find the leading coefficient, which should be the one with the highest exponent. And now write down whether this is up, up, down, 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 up, or up, down. So I have a positive coefficient with an odd power. So positive coefficient, odd power, that's called down and up. I think on your test, I'm just going to ask you to type D and then U. Just follow the directions. I'll tell you exactly how to type it. Let's do one more. And number 2, find the leading coefficient, negative 2x to the 4th. And now go ahead and find the correct end behavior. Negative coefficient with an even power is called down, down. So that's the last, I guess, that you need to know for your test. So practice this. Let me stop my video.